The room is still, the only sound the quiet beeping of machines in the dimly lit chamber. It's 1:31 a.m. on January 13, 2021, and the world, asleep in its comfort, has no idea that history is being written in cold, sterile silence. Lisa Montgomery, her hands trembling but her face expressionless, lies strapped to a gurney in 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗋 federal prison. The air is thick, heavy with the weight of what's about to unfold. In the next few minutes, this woman, whose name had once been whispered across headlines and now sears through the soul of every true crime aficionado, will breathe her last breath. The needle pierces her veins. There is no cry, no desperate plea for mercy. There is nothing but quiet finality. The lethal injection begins to work, sending shockwaves of paralysis through her body, its chilling cold seeping into her veins. This is the moment of reckoning, the end of a life that had caused so much pain, so much sorrow, and yet, there is no satisfaction here. Lisa's final words? No, a single syllable spoken when asked if she had anything to say. No remorse. No apology. Just a silence so heavy, it lingers in the minds of all who hear her story. A haunting silence, the kind that reverberates with the unresolved questions left in her wake. Seconds tick by. The drugs take hold. And by 1:41 a.m., Lisa Montgomery is officially gone. The first woman to be executed by the U.S. federal government in nearly 70 years. A somber end. But for many, the questions are just beginning. Was this justice? Was this punishment truly deserved for a woman who had spent her life fractured, broken by horrors no child should ever know? The world is left to ponder, as the life of a woman who had suffered unimaginable abuse ends with a quiet whimper. And yet, as Lisa's life was extinguished, one thing remained, the haunting memory of Bobbie Jo Stinnett. Bobbie Jo, the victim in this tragic story, was never just a name. She was a young woman with so much promise, a mother-to-be filled with dreams of the future. A future she would never get to live. And the child, Victoria Jo, who fought her way out of a nightmare, whose cries would echo through the hearts of all who followed the story, was left to survive. The true victim was still alive, but her innocence was shattered before she could even understand the world she had entered. In the silence of Lisa Montgomery's execution, it's impossible to escape the brutal reality that the real crime, what was truly stolen from everyone involved, was not just the life of Bobbie Jo. It was the future, the dream, and the very essence of what it means to be human. Bobbie Jo's life was cut short. Her future was never realized. And the child she carried, still clinging to life, was left to pick up the pieces of the wreckage that had been her mother's world. But Lisa Montgomery's death would not be the end. It would only open the door to a far more complicated question. How much of her life was really hers to control? Could a history of unimaginable trauma, of abuse so severe it shaped her every action, be enough to explain the depths of what she did? And what happens when a broken mind is left unchecked? When a person lives in a delusion so deep, it compels them to destroy another person's life in the name of their own fantasy. As the needle worked its grim magic, the nation watched and waited. The story of Bobbie Jo Stinnett and Lisa Montgomery was about to unfold in the most unexpected and horrific way. What was supposed to be an execution was only the beginning of a dark tale that would haunt a small town forever. In a small town nestled quietly in the heart of Missouri, Bobbie Jo Stinnett's life had been filled with the simple joys of family and community. Skidmore, Missouri wasn't a place where people locked their doors at night. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone and neighbors were family. Bobbie Jo was exactly the kind of woman who would make you smile just by walking into a room. Warm, gentle, and with a natural kindness that left an imprint on everyone she met. She was 23, a woman on the cusp of motherhood, glowing with anticipation for the daughter she was about to bring into the world. Bobbie Jo and her husband Zeb had already chosen a name for their baby girl, Victoria Jo. The nursery was ready, the crib assembled, and tiny clothes folded neatly in the dresser drawers. Bobbie Jo couldn't stop talking about the child she was about to welcome into the world. Friends and family recall her as a woman full of excitement, someone whose love for life and family radiated from every conversation. Bobbie Jo wasn't just a mother-to-be, she was a woman with a passion for her work. She and Zeb ran a small but successful dog breeding business from their home. Their farm, Happy Haven Farms, was known among the rat terrier community for producing some of the best pups in the region. Bobbie Jo wasn't just a dog breeder, she was a dedicated professional. She took pride in her business, always active in the dog show circuit and deeply involved in forums with fellow breeders. She built relationships with people all over the country, offering advice, sharing knowledge, and developing a network that trusted her expertise. Her passion for her dogs was only matched by her love for her soon-to-be daughter. But her happiness wasn't just tied to her business or her pregnancy. She was a beloved member of her small town. If you asked anyone in Skidmore about Bobbie Jo, they'd tell you she had one of the most genuine hearts. She was the type of person who would drop everything to help a neighbor, someone whose smile could brighten even the darkest day. And then, there was the person who saw all this, the person who envied it and could not understand it. Lisa Marie Montgomery. To the outside world, Lisa was just another woman, a wife and a mother, but beneath the surface, her life was a web of lies, delusion, and a history of unimaginable abuse. Lisa's childhood was a nightmare. Born into an abusive home, she endured years of sexual assault at the hands of her stepfather, an unrelenting trauma that shattered her sense of self from an early age. When she tried to seek help, her mother's response was nothing short of cruel, threatening her with a gun to keep her silent, forcing her to live in fear and shame. It was a childhood that no one should have to experience, but it was the only reality Lisa knew. By the time Lisa was a teenager, her life had taken a darker turn. She started drinking to escape the pain, but when her mother found out, she didn't offer comfort. Instead, she threatened Lisa, further tightening the noose of fear and isolation that Lisa had been living in. In an attempt to flee the constant abuse, Lisa married young, but both marriages ended in more mistreatment. She had 4 children, but her relationships with men became more fractured as the years went by. As Lisa grew older, her mental health deteriorated. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, depression, PTSD, and, perhaps most disturbingly, 𝗟𝗏𝗁𝗔, a condition where a woman believes she is pregnant, experiencing physical symptoms of pregnancy, even though she is not. Lisa's delusions became more pronounced as she tried to live a normal life. She would fake pregnancies, buying maternity clothes, even showing fake sonograms to convince her family and friends that she was expecting. Each time the lie unraveled, she would create tragic stories about miscarriages or stillbirths. It was a pattern of deception, a desperate attempt to fill the void of something she didn't have, the love, acceptance, and sense of worth that had been stolen from her so many years ago. By the time December 2004 came around, Lisa had fabricated yet another pregnancy. She convinced her new husband, Kevin Montgomery, that she was expecting a child due in December. She showed him fake ultrasound images and kept up the lie with such conviction that, despite the growing gaps in her story, she convinced herself this time it would be real. But the reality of her situation was sinking in. The months were passing, but her body wasn't showing any signs of pregnancy. No swelling, no signs of labor. The lie was falling apart. And that's when she found Bobbie Jo. Bobbie Jo, who had everything Lisa so desperately wanted. A loving husband, a growing family, a future filled with promise. Lisa thought she could take that future for herself. And so, under the guise of a dog breeding transaction, Lisa Montgomery came to Skidmore, Missouri, seeking not a puppy, but a child. Bobbie Jo had no reason to suspect anything. Why would she? She was expecting a visitor, someone who had reached out through a dog breeder forum, expressing interest in buying a puppy. In the trusting nature of her profession, Bobbie Jo welcomed Lisa into her home. But Bobbie Jo's warmth, her kindness, her faith in humanity, would cost her everything that day. As Lisa Montgomery drove those 175 miles to Skidmore, there was no knowing, no warning, no sense of the tragedy that would soon unfold. To her, this wasn't about taking a life. It was about taking what she believed was her last chance to make her delusions real. For Bobbie Jo, this was the last day of a life filled with hope, love, and promise. For Victoria Jo, this was the day she would enter a world she had no way of understanding. A world that had already taken everything from her mother before she was even born. This was the beginning of a nightmare, one that would change not just Bobbie Jo's family but an entire community forever. December 16, 2004, started like any other day in the small, quiet town of Skidmore, Missouri. The chill of the winter air swept across the town, but the sun shone brightly as Bobbie Jo went about her usual morning routine. 8 months pregnant, her belly round with life, she was preparing for a visitor. Someone she had met through an online forum for dog breeders. The woman, whom Bobbie Jo knew only as Darlene Fisher, was interested in purchasing a rat terrier pup, a simple transaction between 2 passionate breeders. Bobbie Jo, kind-hearted and trusting, saw no reason for concern. She wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. What Bobbie Jo didn't know was that as she made breakfast, tended to her dogs, and worked on her business, a tragedy was already on its way, a tragedy that would unravel everything she had worked for, everything she loved, and everything she hoped for. That day, Bobbie Jo would be the victim of one of the most horrific and deliberate crimes imaginable. Lisa Montgomery had left her home in Melbourne, Kansas, that morning, her mind clouded with the dark fantasies she had created over the past months. She had already convinced herself that today would be the day she could take what she wanted most, someone else's child. She wasn't just going to buy a dog, she was going to steal a life. Lisa drove nearly 200 miles to Skidmore, Kansas in her red Honda, her heart racing with anticipation. The road stretched before her, the hours of travel a blur in her single-minded obsession. She had packed with meticulous care, a knife, a length of rope, and the overwhelming belief that she was about to give birth. The delusions that had twisted her mind for so long were now a singular, undeniable truth in her head. This would be her child. The town of Skidmore greeted Lisa with quiet normalcy. She followed the directions, past the fields and small homes, until she reached the White House on Elm Street, the home of Bobbie Jo and 𝗟𝗶𝘀 Stinnett. It was still early when Lisa arrived, and she pulled her car to a stop in front of the modest home. Her nerves flared with a mix of excitement and dread, but there was no turning back. This was her moment. At the front door, she was greeted by Bobbie Jo, a warm smile on her face as she invited Lisa in. They exchanged pleasantries about the dogs, and for a moment, everything seemed just as it should, two breeders discussing their shared passion. Lisa's presence felt completely natural to Bobbie Jo, who knew no reason to feel alarmed. But inside the house, everything was about to change. Once inside, the door closed behind them, and Lisa's true intentions came into play. The struggle happened fast. Lisa's hands, trembling with adrenaline, took hold of the rope. Bobbie Jo, only weeks away from holding her baby girl in her arms, had no idea the nightmare that was about to unfold. She fought fiercely as any mother would to protect her child, but she was overpowered. The screams that tore from Bobbie Jo's throat echoed out, but they weren't just cries for help. They were a desperate plea for survival. Neighbors later reported hearing what they thought was a dog in distress, unaware that it was the desperate sounds of a woman fighting for her life. Bobbie Jo clung to hope, her hands clutching at the rope that tightened around her neck, her strength fading with each gasping breath. It was a fight she couldn't win. And then came the most horrific act of all. As Bobbie Jo's life slipped away, Lisa retrieved a knife, perhaps from Bobbie Jo's own kitchen, and began to cut into the woman's abdomen. There was no skill, no preparation, no medical knowledge. Just raw desperation and a twisted need to make her lie a reality. Lisa sliced through flesh and muscle, tearing into the womb with brutal force. Inside, Victoria Jo, a child just weeks away from being born, was pulled from her mother's body. The baby girl, bloodied but alive, cried out as she entered a world filled with terror and loss. But she was alive. And in that moment, that was a miracle. Lisa, having completed the unspeakable act, quickly wrapped the newborn in a blanket, cleaned her off as best she could, and fled the scene. She held Victoria in her arms as if nothing had happened, as if this baby was her own. She had taken everything from Bobbie Jo, but her delusions were so strong that she convinced herself she had done nothing wrong. Lisa left the house, stepping out into the cold Missouri air with the child she believed was her own. Her heart raced with excitement, the baby cradled against her chest like a prize she had fought so hard for. She drove off, disappearing down the same road she had come in on, leaving the small town in the dark about the tragedy that had just unfolded behind that white door. Back in Skidmore, the quiet of the morning was shattered when Bobbie Jo's mother, 𝗟𝗶𝘀, arrived for her scheduled visit. She had been expecting to see her daughter, to help with the preparations for the baby's arrival. But when she entered the house, she was greeted by a scene from a nightmare. Becky found Bobbie Jo's body lying on the floor, blood pooling around her. There was no sign of the baby. It didn't take long for the horror to sink in. In a panic, Becky called 911, her voice shaking with fear as she described what she had found. The dispatcher struggled to comprehend the full extent of the scene. The baby was gone. 𝗟𝗶𝘀 Stinnett, Bobbie Jo's husband, would find his wife in the same way. He arrived home to find his world shattered, his wife lying dead on the floor, and the child they had dreamed of waiting for was missing. The investigation began immediately. As authorities pieced together the crime, one truth became clear. This wasn't just a murder, it was a kidnapping. A woman had been taken from this world, but so had her child. And somewhere, in the hands of the person who had killed her, a newborn girl was struggling to survive. The hours following the crime were chaotic, but the truth was out there, buried beneath layers of deception and lies. Law enforcement, along with the FBI, scrambled to piece together the puzzle, to find the woman responsible and, more urgently, recover the newborn child. An Amber Alert went out across the country, but there was a haunting twist. They didn't have a photograph of the baby. There were no hospital records, no birth certificate, nothing. All they had was a description of a newborn girl who had never been seen outside the womb. The search was urgent. Every minute counted. The police swarmed Skidmore, knocking on doors, searching for any clue that might lead to the murderer or the child. Meanwhile, in Melbourne, Kansas, a quiet town far from the scene of the crime, Lisa Montgomery was slipping deeper into her fantasy. She had cradled the baby, told people that she had given birth in secret, alone at home. It was a story she had rehearsed 1,000 times. She even had the audacity to convince neighbors that they had seen her pregnant just days earlier. In her mind, this was her child. She had given birth, just as she had always dreamed. But even to those around her, there was something strange about the baby. Her skin was far too clean for someone who had just been born in a bathtub. There was no sign of the typical trauma, no blood, no umbilical cord attached. The newborn, despite being wrapped in a blanket and freshly cleaned, looked too perfect, too healthy. People were starting to notice the cracks in her story, but they didn't yet know the full extent of the truth. As the FBI worked tirelessly to track down leads, they turned to the digital world for answers. They knew Bobbie Jo had been active in online dog breeder forums. It was in these forums that Lisa Montgomery had reached out to Bobbie Jo, under the false name 𝗟𝗀𝗁𝗵𝗃, pretending to be interested in buying a rat terrier puppy. The FBI cyber team moved quickly, combing through the messages exchanged between Bobbie Jo and 𝗟𝗀𝗁𝗵𝗃. They dug into the timestamps, the email headers, and the IP addresses that had been used. What they found didn't take long to piece together. The woman who had pretended to be 𝗟𝗀𝗁𝗵𝗃 was none other than Lisa Montgomery. She had used a fake name to mask her identity, to hide her true intentions. In a frantic, rapid response, agents tracked the digital trail to Melbourne, Kansas. Within hours, they had a suspect, and they knew exactly where to go. Lisa Montgomery had been found. As the FBI stormed the house, they found Lisa calmly cradling the baby. She told them the same story she had been rehearsing, that she had given birth to the child in the privacy of her home. She had even convinced her husband, Kevin, that this was their child. But something wasn't adding up. The baby's skin was still pristine, and there were no signs of the usual marks or trauma of a newborn. No blood, no evidence of labor. It was almost as if the child had been perfectly untouched by the violence it had been ripped from. The investigators didn't need to ask Lisa any more questions. The look in her eyes, the quiet insistence that her story was true, it was all there. The truth was emerging, raw and undeniable. This baby wasn't hers. The DNA results would confirm it beyond doubt. This baby belonged to Bobbie Jo Stinnett. The agents moved swiftly. Lisa Montgomery was arrested, but the real miracle came with the baby. Victoria Jo, still fragile, still wrapped in the blanket her mother had once held her in, was rushed to the hospital for immediate evaluation. Miraculously, she was unharmed. Her cries echoed in the sterile hospital room as doctors worked to ensure she would survive the horror she had been born into. Victoria Jo had made it. She was alive, her tiny body fighting the odds, and she had survived a nightmare no one should ever have to endure. But as she cried for her real mother, the shadow of what had happened would follow her for the rest of her life. For Lisa, the reckoning was just beginning. As she sat in custody, the weight of what she had done began to set in. But there was no remorse, no real understanding of the crime she had committed. All she could see was her own distorted reality, a world where she was the mother and Victoria Jo was her baby. She had stolen a life, but in her mind, she had simply fulfilled the fantasy she had longed for. The FBI had done their job and the baby was safe. But Lisa Montgomery's fate was now sealed. The search for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was packed with emotion. The air was thick with tension as Lisa Montgomery stood before a jury of 12, her fate now in their hands. The crime that had stolen Bobbie Jo Stinnett's life and nearly robbed the world of her daughter was now the focal point of one of the most emotionally charged trials in recent history. The prosecution wasted no time building their case. They didn't just show a murder, they showcased a calculated, methodical act, a crime that had been months in the making. The FBI's investigation had uncovered Lisa's web of lies, her twisted manipulation of the dog breeding community, and her elaborate plan to pose as someone else to gain access to Bobbie Jo's home. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime, it was a deliberate act of desperation, driven by a mind fractured by years of trauma and delusion. The prosecution laid out the timeline, step by agonizing step. The fake pregnancy, the stolen moments between Lisa and Bobbie Jo, the cruel act of violence in the Stinnett home, and the disappearance of the unborn child, all of it was meticulously planned, a tragedy written in every email and every message exchanged under the name 𝗟𝗀𝗁𝗵𝗃. But despite the overwhelming evidence, The defense came prepared with a very different argument. Lisa Montgomery was not the woman the prosecution painted her to be. She was a woman deeply broken by the unthinkable abuse she had suffered in her childhood. The defense didn't deny the brutality of the crime. They couldn't. The crime was too horrific, too senseless. But they argued that Lisa had been a victim long before she ever became a perpetrator. They presented the jury with the staggering truth of Lisa's life, a life marked by sexual abuse at the hands of her stepfather, a life where her mother facilitated and ignored the horrors happening to her child. They showed the jury the damage that had been done to her mind, the decades of trauma that had slowly unraveled her. Lisa's mental health was at the core of the defense's argument. They presented expert testimony from neuropsychologists who discussed the severe impact of the trauma on her brain. They painted a picture of a woman who had dissociative episodes, whose delusions were so strong that they convinced her she was carrying a child when in reality she was not. They argued that Lisa's actions were not premeditated in the traditional sense but were the result of a fractured mind that had never been given the help it so desperately needed. But the prosecution was relentless. They didn't deny Lisa's history of abuse, but they argued that her mental illness didn't excuse her actions. They focused on the methodical nature of her crime, her cold disregard for Bobbie Jo's life, and the brutal way she had stolen Victoria Jo from her mother's womb. The jury had to ask themselves if a lifetime of trauma could ever justify such an unfathomable crime. The victim, Bobbie Jo Stinnett, was never far from the courtroom. The prosecution reminded the jury again and again of the life that had been stolen, the child who would never grow up with her mother. They talked about 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗀 Stinnett, who had been left to raise his daughter alone, carrying the weight of his wife's death and the horror of knowing how she had died. They showed the jury Bobbie Jo's warmth, her kindness, her love for her family, and how that all had been ripped away in the blink of an eye. When the verdict came, the courtroom fell into a haunting silence. The jury found Lisa Montgomery guilty of kidnapping resulting in death. The prosecution had made their case. Lisa's actions were calculated and the punishment was fitting. The jury's recommendation was clear: death. In the years that followed, the legal battle raged on. Lisa's attorneys filed appeal after appeal, citing her mental health, arguing that the death penalty for a mentally ill woman was unconstitutional. The world watched as the fight for Lisa's life played out in courtrooms, with many people, including mental health advocates, pleading for clemency. But despite the overwhelming evidence of her psychological damage, the system had made its decision. Lisa Montgomery became the first woman to be executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years. The execution took place in the early hours of January 13, 2021. Lisa, with no final words, was pronounced dead at 1:41 a.m. A brutal, final end to a life marked by unspeakable pain, trauma, and an unspeakable crime. For Bobbie Jo Stinnett's family, the execution was the end of one chapter. But the true toll of the crime had been felt long before the gavel fell in that courtroom. The emotional scars of losing a daughter, a sister, and a mother couldn't be erased by any sentence, no matter how severe. Victoria Jo, now a young girl, was the miracle of this tragedy. She had survived the horror that no child should ever have to experience. She was raised by 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗀 Stinnett, who had become the one constant in her life, even as the memories of her mother haunted their every step. Victoria's story, though tragic, was one of survival. She grew up in a world where her mother's love was felt through every milestone, where the pain of her loss was always present, but where the strength of her spirit, and the spirit of Bobbie Jo, lived on. Lisa Montgomery's execution may have closed the case, but the emotional scars left behind on both sides, on the family of Bobbie Jo, on the broken woman who had stolen her life, would never truly heal. It was a story that would stay with everyone involved for the rest of their lives, a haunting reminder of the depths of human suffering and the consequences of ignoring the darkness that can take root in the deepest recesses of the mind. If you were moved by this story, hit that like button, share with others, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling true crime stories that you won't want to miss. Your support helps us bring these heartbreaking, powerful stories to light. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What are your feelings on this case? Do you think justice was served? Let's discuss it together.